Welcome back, everyone, and if you're new here, I'm so glad you found the channel. We're on an exciting journey to reach 10k subscribers by next year, and every like, comment and subscription brings us one step closer. Your support means everything. Now, let's jump into today's video. The meeting that changed my life happened on a rainy Friday in October. I remember because the clouds hung so low over Fort Bragg that our choppers had been grounded, and the constant drumming of rain against the briefing room windows made everything feel surreal, like I was underwater. General Harrison didn't look like the kind of man who dealt in monsters. He wore his stars with the casual authority of someone who'd earned them in the dirt, not behind a desk. His weathered face and calloused hands told stories of operations that would never make it into any history book, but it was his eyes that caught my attention. They held the haunted look I'd seen in veterans who'd witnessed things they couldn't explain away. Staff Sergeant Thomas Walker, he said, sliding a folder across the table. 15 years in Delta Force, multiple tours in locations I'm not supposed to know about, specialized in reconnaissance and hostile target elimination. And most importantly, you've got a record of keeping your mouth shut about things that don't make sense. I didn't touch the folder. In my experience, folders like that came with strings that could hang a man. With respect, sir, I've got 2 months left before retirement. Harrison's laugh was hollow. Retirement. Tell me, Walker, how's the sleep been since that operation in Kazakhstan? My hand twitched involuntarily. The Kazakhstan mission wasn't in any of my official files. We'd been sent in to eliminate a terrorist cell operating out of an abandoned Soviet research facility. What we found instead, I'd spent 3 years convincing myself it was just a hallucination brought on by bad intel and worse air filtration. That wasn't in my report, sir. No, it wasn't. Just like the entity you encountered in the Hindu Kush wasn't in your Afghanistan reports, or the sounds your team heard in that cave system in Yemen. Harrison leaned forward. You're good at rationalizing, Walker. Maybe the best I've seen, but we both know you've seen things that don't fit into the normal world. Things that shouldn't exist. He pressed a button on a remote, and the wall behind him transformed into a high-definition display. The footage was grainy, taken at night, but I could make out a military patrol moving through dense forest, standard formation, proper spacing, everything by the book, until the trees started moving wrong. Not swaying in the wind, but twisting, reaching. The timestamp showed this was from 3 weeks ago. Keep watching, Harrison said quietly. The patrol's point man stopped, raising his fist in the universal signal to hold. Night vision showed him clearly, right up until the moment he was there, and then he wasn't. No sound, no movement, no distortion. Just there, and then gone, like someone had edited him out of existence. The rest of the footage dissolved into chaos. Muzzle flashes lit up the night. I could see soldiers firing at shadows that moved against the direction of their weapon lights. One of those shadows just reached out, and a soldier's torso separated from his legs like he'd been sliced by an invisible blade. Harrison paused the footage. This was a Tier 1 team, Walker, best of the best. Out of 12 operators, only 2 made it back. 1 died from cardiac arrest during debrief. The other... He clicked to a new image showing a man strapped to a hospital bed. His eyes were open, mouth frozen in a silent scream. He hasn't slept or blinked in 15 days, just stares and screams if we try to close his eyes. What am I looking at, sir? The future of warfare. Harrison stood, straightening his uniform. Or the end of it. We're not sure which yet. What we do know is that the things that go bump in the night aren't just stories anymore. Every culture, every civilization has its monsters, its nightmares. We thought they were myths, ways to explain the unexplainable. We were wrong. He touched the screen, bringing up a map dotted with red markers. In the last 36 months, we've recorded over 300 encounters with entities that defy conventional explanation. Skinwalkers in Arizona. Something that matches medieval descriptions of a Nukkalevi off the coast of Scotland. A pack of creatures in Siberia that might be the inspiration for Wendigo legends. And those are just the ones we can classify. Cryptids, I said, the word feeling strange in my mouth. That's what the eggheads call them. We call them priority zero threats. Conventional weapons are useless against most of them. Conventional tactics get good men killed. That's why we're putting together a new kind of unit. Project Wraith. I finally opened the folder. Inside was a single sheet of paper with 2 lines. Are you willing to hunt monsters? Below it, 2 boxes, yes or no. Harrison handed me a pen. Before you decide, there's something you need to see. A living specimen we captured last month. After that, if you still want to retire, I'll personally sign your papers. The facility underneath Fort Bragg wasn't on any official blueprint. We took an elevator down at least 20 floors, passed through 7 security checkpoints, each requiring different biometric scans. The walls changed from standard military issue to something that looked more like a bank vault designed by NASA. The air had a sharp, antiseptic smell that barely masked something else, something that reminded me of rotting meat left in the sun. The containment cells are lined with experimental materials, Harrison explained as we approached a massive door. Osmium steel alloy, enhanced with elements I'm not cleared to know about. Electromagnetic fields, sonic deterrents, dimensional anchors. Everything we can think of to keep them in. Them? The door hissed open, revealing a circular chamber dominated by a cylindrical enclosure that stretched from floor to ceiling. The walls looked like glass, but had the rainbow sheen of an oil slick. Inside was... I'd like to say my training kicked in. The 15 years of special operations experience had prepared me for what I saw, but nothing could have prepared me for that moment. The creature was roughly humanoid, if you'd only heard humans described but never seen one. Its limbs were too long, joints bending in impossible directions. The skin was translucent, showing organs that pulsed and shifted like they were trying to escape. But its face, Christ, its face. It had too many eyes, all of them focused on me, with an intelligence that felt ancient and hungry. Juvenile Wendigo, Harrison said, his voice clinical. Captured after it killed a family of 4 in northern Minnesota. We think it's less than a year old. As if responding to its classification, the creature moved. One moment it was in the center of the enclosure, the next it was pressed against the barrier inches from my face. Its mouth opened, revealing row upon row of needle teeth, and opened, until its head had unfolded like a blooming flower made of bone and hunger. Then it passed through the barrier like it wasn't there. The alarms were deafening. Red emergency lights flooded the chamber. I reached for a sidearm I wasn't carrying, falling back on years of training that meant nothing in that moment. Harrison hadn't moved, hadn't even flinched. The Wendigo stood between us, its body twisting in ways that hurt my eyes. It reached for me with hands that ended in foot-long talons, and stopped. Dimensional anchor engaged, a computerized voice announced. The creature shuddered, its form becoming more solid, more real. It let out a sound that might have been a scream, might have been laughter, before being yanked back into its enclosure like a puppet on strings. Gets out 2 or 3 times a week, Harrison said casually, testing our containment systems, learning. They all learn. That's what makes them so dangerous. He turned to me. Still want to retire? I looked at the creature, now prowling its enclosure with predatory grace. It cocked its head at me, and for a moment I swore it smiled. I took the pen from my pocket and checked the yes box. When do we start? Harrison's smile didn't reach his eyes. Training begins tomorrow. Hope you remember your exorcism prayers, Walker. You're going to need them. The next 3 months were a crash course in everything humanity wasn't supposed to know. Our training facility was a repurposed missile silo in Wyoming, converted into what they called the Cryptid Response Operations Center, or CROC. Real creative military minds at work there. My team was a hand-picked group of specialists, each chosen for specific experiences with the unexplained. Jackson Cooper was our weapons expert, a former Navy SEAL who'd encountered something in the Mariana Trench that made him afraid of water. Dr. Isabella Romano had been CIA, specializing in folklore until she realized the stories she was studying were still happening. Kevin Phillips, call sign Ghost, was our tracker, his Native American heritage giving him insights into creatures his ancestors had been fighting long before Europe knew America existed. Michael Torres rounded out the team, a tech genius who developed half the detection systems we used after something followed him home through his computer screen. The training itself defied description. We learned to fight enemies that could ignore physics, predict the future, or turn our own fears against us. Standard firearms were supplemented with weapons that looked like they'd been designed by mad scientists with a horror movie fetish. The phase disruptor rifle could force entities to remain in our dimension long enough to hurt them. Psychic dampeners protected our minds from creatures that could drive a man insane with a glance. But the hardest part was learning to trust our instincts while doubting our senses. Reality is negotiable around cryptids, Dr. Romano would lecture. If something looks wrong, it is wrong. If your gut tells you that shadow just moved upstream against the current, believe it. The human mind naturally tries to rationalize the irrational. Stop. That hesitation will get you killed. They showed us footage of failed containment operations, taught us to recognize dimensional weak points, made us memorize banishing rituals from a dozen cultures. We learned that silver really does work against some creatures, that cold iron can disrupt ethereal entities, that UV light can reveal things hiding in plain sight. Our first live fire exercise was supposed to be a simple tracking scenario. They released a minor entity into the training course, a maze of corridors and rooms designed to simulate urban combat. We were supposed to locate it, contain it, and practice proper handling procedures. Nobody expected it to be real. The creature had started as a training hologram, one we'd worked with dozens of times before. But somehow the simulation had drawn something else in. Something that wore the hologram like a suit, using our familiarity against us. Torres spotted it first. "That's not right," he said over the comms. "The projection's moving wrong. Patterns all wrong." Before any of us could respond, the hologram flickered, and something else stepped through it. The thing was like a praying mantis crossed with a shadow, its movements jerky and smooth at the same time. It turned its head 180 degrees to look at us, and I felt my nose start to bleed. "Contact!" Cooper shouted, bringing up his phase disruptor. The creature moved faster than thought, flowing across the ceiling like spilled ink. Ghost opened fire with consecrated rounds, tracking it with an accuracy that seemed impossible. Dr. Romano began reciting something in Latin, her voice steady even as blood ran from her eyes. The next few minutes were chaos. The creature kept shifting between dimensions, appearing and disappearing at will. Standard tactics were useless. It could attack from any angle, including through solid walls. 3 times it almost took someone's head off, with limbs that seemed to stretch forever. Finally, Ghost managed to pin it down with a Native American binding ritual, while Cooper and I hit it with concentrated phase disruptor fire. The creature collapsed in on itself, with a sound like reality tearing, leaving behind a smell like burning plastic and ozone. We stood there, breathing hard, covered in sweat and blood from various orifices. Our training gear was shredded, and the course itself looked like a war zone. "Well," Torres said, wiping blood from his nose, "guess the training's gone live." Harrison appeared from an observation room, looking grimly satisfied. "Congratulations on surviving your first real encounter. Training's over. You deploy for your first actual mission in 48 hours. As we headed for decontamination, I caught Ghost looking troubled. "Something wrong?" He nodded slowly. "That binding ritual shouldn't have worked. It was meant for skinwalkers, not whatever that was." He met my eyes. Either we got very lucky, or something wanted us to win. Looking back, I should have paid more attention to his words. Should have realized that even then we were being tested, evaluated, prepared. But we were too busy celebrating our victory, too focused on the adrenaline rush of surviving our first real cryptid encounter. We didn't realize that everything, the training, the encounter, our very selection, was part of a larger plan. We were so focused on learning to hunt monsters that we never stopped to ask why they were suddenly letting themselves be found. That oversight would come back to haunt us sooner than we expected. The Monongahela National Forest stretched before us like a dark ocean, its endless waves of pine and oak swallowing the last rays of sunset. Our Black Hawk flew low, hugging the terrain as Cooper checked our equipment one final time. The phase disruptors hummed with an energy that made my teeth ache. "Thermal imaging shows temperature inversions throughout the area," Torres reported, his eyes glued to an array of screens that displayed everything from standard heat signatures to dimensional frequency variations. Multiple cold spots that don't match the surrounding environment. Whatever's out there, it's playing havoc with the local physics. Dr. Romano nodded, making notes in a tablet hardened against electromagnetic interference. Consistent with the reports, 7 missing hikers in the past month. Local wildlife behaving erratically. Park rangers finding animals turned inside out but still alive. She looked up, her expression grim. Classic skinwalker behavior, but the pattern's wrong. They usually stay mobile, hunting across huge territories. These attacks are all concentrated in a 5-mile radius. "They're protecting something," Ghost said quietly. He hadn't stopped staring at the forest since we took off. His hands moved constantly over his ritual components. Leather pouches filled with sacred herbs. Bone charms carved with symbols that hurt to look at. And a necklace made from what he claimed were Wendigo teeth. The forest feels wrong. Angry. I knew what he meant. Even from the air, something about the landscape below set off every alarm bell in my combat-trained mind. The shadows seemed too deep, the clearings too perfect. Nature abhors straight lines, but I could swear I saw geometric patterns in the way the trees were arranged. 2 minutes to landing zone, the pilot announced. Be advised, we're getting some strange interference with our instruments. Set us down fast and get clear, I ordered. We'll signal for extraction once we've contained the threat. The pilot nodded, but I could see the relief on his face. Nobody wanted to stay in this area longer than necessary. The LZ was a small clearing that our intel suggested was relatively safe from cryptid activity. As soon as we touched down, Torres deployed his detection array, a series of sensors that looked like high-tech survey equipment crossed with ancient totems. The screens lit up immediately. "Multiple contacts," he reported. "At least 3 distinct signatures, maybe more. They're moving in patterns. These things are coordinating." Cooper chambered around in his phase disruptor. "Skinwalkers hunt in packs, but they're not known for tactics. This is new behavior." "Everything about this is new behavior," Dr. Romano said. She was studying readings from her own instruments. "The dimensional barriers in this area are paper thin. It's like something's been systematically weakening them." Ghost had moved to the edge of the clearing, crouching to examine marks in the soil. "These tracks, They're wrong." He gestured us over. In the dirt were footprints that seemed to shift as we looked at them, changing from human to animal and back. But what caught my attention were the symbols carved into the ground around them. "Those look like the markings from Kazakhstan," I said, the memories flooding back. The research facility, the sounds, the way reality had bent. Similar but not identical. Dr. Romano crouched beside us. "These are older, much older. And they're not just random markings, they're a formula, a calculation." "What kind of calculation?" Cooper asked. Before she could answer, every sensor Torres had deployed screamed to life. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in seconds. The trees around us grew darker, their shadows stretching toward our position like grasping fingers. "Multiple contacts," Torres shouted. "They're moving in fast from all directions." "Form up," I ordered. We took defensive positions in a circle, weapons ready. Ghost began a low chant, spreading blessed sage smoke in a protective circle around us. Dr. Romano's hands flew over her tablet, trying to get readings. They came out of the darkness like living shadows, humanoid figures that moved with a liquid grace that made my eyes hurt. Their forms constantly shifted. One moment they looked almost human. The next, they were twisted parodies of wolves or bears. But their eyes stayed the same. Ancient, hungry, and far too intelligent. "Parameters don't match known skinwalker signatures," Torres called out, his voice steady despite the horror before us. "These are something else." The creatures circled us just outside the boundary of Ghost's sage smoke. One of them opened its mouth, not just its mouth, but its entire head, unfolding like a flower made of teeth and shadows. It spoke, its voice a symphony of screams. "The barriers grow thin," it said in perfect English. "Your weapons mean nothing. Your rituals are children's rhymes. You cannot stop what comes." Cooper opened fire, his phase disruptor cutting through the dimensional frequencies the creature was using to maintain its form. It screamed, a sound that made blood run from our ears, but instead of dissipating like we expected, it simply shifted. The energy from the phase disruptor was absorbed, transformed, and the creature grew larger. "Fall back," I ordered, but we were surrounded. The skinwalkers, or whatever they were, began closing their circle. Ghost's sage smoke barrier started to fade, the protective energies being consumed by our attackers. Dr. Romano grabbed my arm. "The symbols, they're not just calculations, they're coordinates. These things aren't hunting here, they're trying to open something." As if in response, the ground beneath us began to tremble. The geometric patterns I'd noticed from the air started to glow with a sickly green light. The skinwalkers raised their twisted heads and began to howl, a sound that contained languages never meant for human throats. Torres screamed in warning, but it was too late. Reality cracked. There's no other way to describe it. A fissure opened in the air itself, spreading like a spiderweb of broken glass. Through the cracks, I caught glimpses of somewhere else, a place of twisted geometries and impossible colors, and something was looking back. "New contact!" Torres's voice cracked with panic. "Massive dimensional disturbance. Whatever's coming through, it's bigger than anything in our database." "The barriers fall," the first skinwalker said, its voice now a chorus of thousands. "The way opens, the empty ones return." That's when Torres vanished. One moment he was there, monitoring his equipment. The next, nothing. No sound, no flash of light, no distortion. Just gone, leaving his gear behind, screens still displaying readings that made no sense. Cooper opened up with full auto-phase disruptor fire, sweeping the beam through the circle of creatures. Ghost threw handfuls of blessed herbs into the air, his voice rising in ancient prayers. Dr. Romano activated some kind of experimental device that emitted a high-pitched whine, making the air ripple. I reached for Torres's fallen equipment. hoping to get some reading that would tell us what happened to him. As I touched the screen, reality hiccuped. That's the only way I can describe it. Like someone had spliced a frame out of existence. When the world snapped back into focus, I was alone. The clearing was empty. No team, no skinwalkers, no dimensional tears. Even the symbols in the dirt were gone. The forest was silent in a way that felt artificial, like nature itself was holding its breath. My radio crackled. "Walker, Walker, do you copy?" It was Cooper's voice, but something was wrong with it. It seemed to come from very far away, and there was an echo that shouldn't have been possible with our equipment. "Cooper, what's your position?" I don't know. Everything's wrong. The trees... Christ, the trees are breathing. Romano's with me, but she's not. She keeps saying she can see through time. Ghost is gone. Just gone. I checked my tactical display, but the coordinates were meaningless. Numbers that kept changing, shifting between impossible values. My watch had stopped, but the second hand was moving backward. "Listen to me," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "We need to regroup. Head for the extraction point." Cooper's laugh was edged with hysteria. "Which one? I can see 3 different clearings, all overlapping. Reality's thin here, Walker. Like tissue paper, I can see... Oh God." His voice cut off in static. In the distance, something howled, a sound that carried both triumph and hunger. The shadows under the trees began to move again, but now they were deeper, darker, more permanent. I activated my emergency beacon and started moving. The extraction point was supposed to be a mile north, but my compass was spinning wildly. The stars above were visible through the clouds, but they were all wrong. Constellations that shouldn't exist, moving in ways that defied astronomy. As I walked, I began to notice things. Small things at first. The way the grass bent away from my footsteps before I took them. The way the wind carried whispers in languages that made my teeth hurt. The way the moonlight seemed to cast shadows that pointed toward the sun. Then I saw Torres's equipment again, exactly as it had fallen, screen still active. But I'd been walking for at least 20 minutes. Looking at the screens, I finally understood what the readings meant. The skinwalkers hadn't been trying to open a way for something to come through. They'd been trying to make this whole area cross over, and according to Torres's instruments, they'd succeeded. I wasn't in West Virginia anymore. At least not the West Virginia I knew. I was somewhere between dimensions, in a place where reality was more suggestion than law, and somewhere in this twisted version of the forest, my team was scattered, lost in their own pockets of broken space-time. The howling came again, closer now. In the distance, I saw something moving through the trees. Something big. Something that cast shadows in directions that shadows shouldn't exist. I checked my phase disruptor's charge, full power. I had enough blessed ammunition to fight off a small army. Ghost had made sure we all carried emergency ritual components, and Dr. Romano's experimental devices were still humming in my pack. I was trained to hunt monsters. Instead, I'd found something worse, a place where the monsters came from, but my team was out there, lost in this nightmare forest, and I was going to find them, even if I had to tear reality apart to do it. The creature in the trees moved closer, its form shifting between shapes that biology had never intended. I raised my weapon and began moving towards it. If these things wanted to show us their home dimension, fine. Let's show them why humans are the scariest creatures of all. In 15 years of special operations, I'd learned that fear is like a gun. Useful if you control it. Lethal if you don't. But the thing stalking me through this twisted version of Monongahela wasn't triggering fear. It was triggering something older, something buried deep in human DNA from when we huddled in caves and knew we weren't the apex predator. The creature moved like oil on water, its form rippling between shapes. One moment, It was impossibly tall and thin, joints bending backward. The next, it was low and predatory, leaving footprints that smouldered. The trees around it seemed to lean away, their branches trembling despite the absolute stillness of the air. I kept moving, using every bit of my training to stay quiet while scanning for signs of my team. The phase disruptor hummed in my hands, its power cell casting a faint blue glow that seemed to make the shadows retreat. But something was wrong with the weapon. The frequency modulators were spinning wildly, trying to lock onto dimensional signatures that shouldn't exist. That's when I found the bunker. It was hidden beneath a rock formation that looked natural, until you noticed how the angles aligned too perfectly. The entrance was sealed with a heavy steel door, marked with familiar symbols, US military, but not any division I recognized. The lock was modern, electronic, requiring both keycard and code. The door was torn open from the inside. My tactical light revealed a corridor slanting down into darkness. The walls were lined with the same osmium steel alloy we used in our containment cells, but here it was scarred and pitted, corroded in patterns that formed unsettling shapes. Emergency lights cast intermittent red glows that did more to create shadows than dispel them. I found Cooper's boot print in the dust near the entrance. At least part of my team had found this place. Following standard operating procedure for compromised structures, I began a careful advance into the facility. The first room I encountered was clearly a research station. Banks of old computers lined the walls, their screens dark except for one that flickered with random symbols. Papers were scattered everywhere, yellowed with age but still readable. What I saw made my blood run cold. Project Legacy Classification, Omega Black Date, 1962. The document detailed experiments conducted on captured entities during the height of the Cold War. But these weren't just studies, they were attempts at weaponization. The government hadn't just known about cryptids, they'd been trying to control them. A photo showed what looked like a skinwalker strapped to an operating table, its flesh split open to reveal organs that defied biology. Notes in the margins referenced dimensional frequency matching and psychic warfare potential. Walker, the voice crackled through my radio, distorted but recognizable. Walker, if you can hear this, found something, lower levels. Romano's hurt bad. Something's changing her. Cooper, what's your location? Only static answered, but now I had a direction. The facility plans on the walls showed 3 sub-levels, with the lowest marked only as containment. As I moved deeper, the corruption of the walls grew worse. The metal was not just pitted, but transformed, taking on organic patterns that pulsed in the emergency lighting. The air grew thick, with an electromagnetic charge that made my skin crawl, and my equipment malfunction in strange ways. Level 2 held more research labs, but these were different. Newer equipment had been installed alongside the old, some of it still running on emergency power. One screen displayed a map of the United States covered in pulsing red dots, outbreak sites each tagged with dates and cryptid classifications. The dates ran from 1947 to present day, showing an exponential increase in activity. But it was the classified files scattered across a central desk that revealed the true horror. Project Legacy hadn't ended in the 60s. It had evolved. Under various code names and black budget programs, the military had continued its research, not just studying cryptids, but actively trying to merge their capabilities with human subjects. The photos showed the results. Test subjects twisted into impossible shapes, failed hybridization attempts that defied description, and in the most recent files, successes. Soldiers enhanced with cryptid DNA, able to shift between dimensions or manipulate reality itself. A video file played on a loop on one monitor. A test subject, his face blurred but wearing a military uniform, phased through a solid wall. Another lifted a tank with tendrils of pure darkness. A third opened what looked like a portal to somewhere else, somewhere that hurt to look at. Magnificent, isn't it? I spun, phase disruptor raised. Dr. Romano stood in the doorway, but something was wrong. Her skin seemed to shift and flow, like it wasn't quite solid anymore. Her eyes had changed, becoming deep pools of swirling darkness. The next stage of human evolution, she continued, her voice resonating at frequencies that made my teeth vibrate. We thought we were hunting them, containing them, but they were guiding us, teaching us, showing us what we could become. Romano, you're compromised. Whatever's happening to you, we can fix it. The extraction team cannot reach us. She smiled, her teeth too sharp, too numerous. This facility exists in a pocket of altered space-time. The skinwalkers didn't create this bubble of warped reality. They revealed it. It's been here since the 60s, generated by experiments that broke down the walls between dimensions. She moved closer, her movements too fluid, too graceful. They chose us, Walker, all those encounters in our pasts, the things we saw that we couldn't explain. We were being tested, selected, prepared. For what? Transcendence. The words seemed to echo from multiple throats. Humanity is changing. The barriers between realities are failing. What's coming cannot be stopped, but we can adapt, evolve, become something greater. I activated my phase disruptor's containment protocols. Where's Cooper? Struggling, fighting the change. Ghost understood. He embraced it. You should see him now. Beautiful, perfect. Torres. She paused, head tilting at an impossible angle. Torres had to be unmade. His mind couldn't handle the transformation. That's when I noticed the shadows behind her were moving wrong. They weren't cast by the emergency lights. They were reaching for me, taking shapes that belonged in nightmares. Last chance, Romano. Stand down. Her laugh echoed through dimensions that shouldn't exist. You still don't understand. Project Legacy, Project Wraith, they're all part of the same plan. We're not supposed to stop the cryptids. We're supposed to become them. She lunged, her form dissolving into a writhing mass of shadows and teeth. I fired, the phase disruptor's beam cutting through dimensional frequencies, trying to lock her into a single form. She screamed, a sound that contained lifetimes of pain and ecstasy, but kept coming. The shadows around her surged forward, taking shapes from my darkest memories. I saw the thing from Kazakhstan, the horror from the Hindu Kush, all my past encounters given form and substance. Romano had access to my file. She knew every unexplained incident in my career. But she didn't know about the modifications I'd made to my equipment. I triggered the emergency overload on my phase disruptor's power core. The weapon detonated in a burst of energy, designed to disrupt dimensional frequencies. Romano's twisted form was caught in the blast. Her shadows scattered, her screams cutting off as reality reasserted itself. When my vision cleared, she was gone. Whether destroyed or simply banished to another dimension, I couldn't tell. The shadows had retreated, but the facility felt different now. Aware. Hungry. My tactical display was going haywire, showing multiple contacts converging on my position. Through the walls, I could hear something large moving, its footsteps echoing through impossible geometries. And somewhere below, from the lowest level, came the sound of Cooper screaming. I checked my backup weapons and the experimental devices in my pack. If Romano was right, if this was all part of some grand plan to evolve humanity into something else, then I had to end it. Had to find Cooper, if anything of him still remained human. Had to stop whatever was happening in this facility before it spread beyond the dimensional bubble containing it. The map showed a secure elevator to the lowest level. As I approached it, I saw fresh claw marks in the osmium steel walls, claw marks that formed patterns similar to the symbols we'd found in the forest. This wasn't random damage. It It was a language, a formula, a key to understanding what was really happening. I just hoped I lived long enough to decode it. The elevator doors opened on their own, revealing a darkness that seemed to breathe. From below came sounds no human throat could make, and beneath them Cooper's voice chanting in languages that had never existed on Earth. I stepped into the elevator. The doors closed like a mouth sealing shut. I was about to discover just how deep this conspiracy really went, and something told me that General Harrison had known everything from the start. The descent began, and with it, the real horror. The elevator's descent took an eternity. My tactical display showed we'd passed well below the facility's documented 3 levels, dropping into depths that shouldn't exist. The temperature fluctuated wildly. One moment frost formed on my gear, the next sweat poured down my face. The air grew thick with possibilities, each breath tasting like ozone, an ancient stone. Cooper's chanting grew louder, but now it was joined by other voices. I recognized Ghost's deep baritone, twisted into frequencies that made my vision blur. Underneath it all was a sound like massive gears turning, as if reality itself was being rewound. The elevator stopped with a jolt that defied physics. I felt the impact, but there was no deceleration. The doors opened onto a scene from humanity's oldest nightmares. I stood at the edge of a vast chamber that shouldn't have been possible. The ceiling stretched up into darkness, supported by columns that seemed to be made of writhing shadows. The floor was a complex pattern of intersecting lines and circles, each carved with symbols that hurt to look at, and in the center, Cooper hung suspended in mid-air, his body contorted into impossible angles. His skin had become translucent, showing organs that pulsed with an inner light. Around him, Ghost danced and chanted, his form shifting between human and something else with each movement. His ritual components had merged with his flesh, turning him into a living totem of bone and blessed herbs. But it was what floated above them that drove me to my knees. A tear in reality hung in the air, but calling it a portal would be like calling the sun a light bulb. Through it I could see everything. All possibilities, all dimensions, all times existing simultaneously. And looking back through that infinite window were things that predated existence itself. Beautiful, isn't it? General Harrison stepped out of the shadows, but he wasn't alone. The thing that had once been Dr. Romano flowed around him like a living shadow, her form constantly shifting between shapes drawn from primal fears. Behind them stood Torres, or what remained of him. His body had become a living equation, numbers and symbols flowing across his skin, in patterns that described the death of universes. "What is this?" My voice sounded thin in the charged air. Harrison smiled, but the expression belonged on something that had never been human. The truth, the real purpose of Project Wraith, of everything we've done since we first discovered what lurked in the spaces between reality. He gestured at the portal. They've always been here, watching us. The things you call cryptids, they're not separate species. They're different attempts at the same goal, evolution, beyond the prison of single-dimensional existence. Every culture's monsters, every nightmare that kept our ancestors awake, they were glimpses of what we could become. "We're not meant to be like them," I said, but even as I spoke, I felt something stirring in my blood. Every cryptid encounter in my past had left its mark, changing me in ways too subtle to notice. Until now. "Meant to be?" Harrison laughed, the sound echoing through multiple dimensions. "We already are them. Where do you think humanity came from? We're not native to this reality. We're an experiment, seeded here eons ago, engineered to evolve into something greater." Cooper's chanting reached a crescendo. The portal pulsed, and for a moment I saw what waited on the other side with horrible clarity. Vast intelligences that existed in geometries nature never intended, watching our universe like scientists studying bacteria, in a petri dish. The barriers between dimensions are failing, Harrison continued. Reality itself is becoming fluid. We can either evolve to survive in what comes next, or we can perish. Project Wraith wasn't about hunting monsters. It was about becoming them. Every mission, every encounter was designed to expose you to specific dimensional frequencies, to catalyze the changes already written in your DNA. My skin felt too tight, like something inside was trying to emerge. The shadows around me began to move with my thoughts, responding to instincts I didn't know I had. Why show me this? Why not just let it happen? Because you're different, Romano's voice came from everywhere at once. Your resistance to the change, your ability to hold on to your humanity, despite everything you've seen. It makes you perfect. A bridge between what humanity is and what it must become. Ghost turned to face me, his features flowing like wax. The choice must be conscious, willing. That's what they learned in 1962. Forced evolution creates monsters. True transcendence requires acceptance. I looked at my team, at what they'd become. Cooper's suspended form pulsed with otherworldly energy. Torres's mathematical flesh described theorems that could break reality. Romano's shadow form suggested possibilities that human biology had never imagined. And Ghost had become something shamans had dreamed of for millennia. And if I refuse, then you die. Harrison's form began to shift, revealing what he'd truly become. Reality is being rewritten. The laws of physics are more like suggestions now. The only way to survive is to become something that doesn't need them. I raised my phase disruptor, but the weapon sparked and died. In this place, this deep in warped space-time, conventional technology was worse than useless. That's when I felt it, a pulse of something ancient in my blood. Every cryptid encounter had changed me, yes, but not in the way they expected. I wasn't becoming a monster. I was becoming something else. The shadows around me solidified, but not into the twisted shapes the others had adopted. Instead, they formed patterns I recognized from every culture's art, the fundamental symbols humanity had used to make sense of chaos, the very things that made us human, our ability to find meaning in madness, to impose order on entropy. You're right, I said, feeling power surge through me. We're changing, but not into them, into what we were always meant to be. I reached out, not with my hand, but with something that had been growing inside me since Kazakhstan. The portal shuddered. The beings on the other side recoiled. Impossible, Harrison breathed. You're not just adapting, you're human, I finished. More human than we've ever been. The chamber erupted into chaos. Harrison and Romano launched themselves at me, their forms warping through impossible geometries. Torres began reciting equations that made reality scream. Ghost's chanting reached frequencies that shattered the very air. But they'd forgotten something crucial about humanity. We didn't just survive in chaos, we thrived in it. Every horror story, every monster myth, was really about our ability to face the impossible and remain ourselves. I let the power flow through me, channeling every story ever told about heroes facing darkness. The shadows around me formed into shapes from humanity's collective unconscious. Not the twisted forms of cryptids, but the archetypal symbols of order and light. Cooper's body began to glow brighter, his chanting changing from alien sounds to something older, the first songs humans had ever sung to drive away darkness. The portal above us fluctuated, the entities beyond it reeling from something they'd never expected. We weren't becoming like them. They were being changed by us. The chamber shook as reality tried to reassert itself. The infinite possibilities shown through the portal began to collapse into more limited, more human patterns. Harrison screamed as his transformed body began to lose coherence. "What have you done?" Reminded them why they were really afraid of us, I said, feeling the truth of it in my bones. We're not their experiment. We're their replacements. The portal imploded with a sound that existed in no frequency humans could hear. The chamber began to collapse, dimensions folding in on themselves. My team, what remained of them, were caught in the dimensional collapse. I reached for them, not with hands, but with something deeper. Something that had been growing in all of us since humans first gathered around fires to tell stories about the dark. One by one, I pulled them back from the brink of transcendence, back to humanity. Cooper fell from his suspension, his flesh becoming solid again. Torres's mathematical manifestation collapsed into normal equations. Romano's shadows solidified into human form. Ghost's tribal aspects settled into natural patterns. Harrison wasn't so lucky. He'd gone too far, changed too much. As reality reasserted itself, he simply unraveled, his form splitting across too many dimensions to survive in just one. As the chamber collapsed around us, I gathered my team and ran for the elevator. Behind us, the infinite possibilities of inhuman evolution collapsed into the more limited, but far more interesting possibilities of being human. We emerged from the facility into a forest that had returned to normal. The dimensional bubble had collapsed, taking with it all the twisted realities and impossible geometries. The sun was rising, casting normal shadows that behaved exactly as shadows should. My team was unconscious but alive, their bodies showing no signs of their brief transformation. As I called for emergency extraction, I looked at my own hands, seeing them cast shadows that moved just slightly wrong. We had changed, yes, but not into monsters, into something the entities beyond the portal feared more. Humans who understood their own power. Humans who could look into infinity and remain themselves. Humans who could tell stories about the darkness and make the darkness listen. The cryptids were still out there, and more would come as reality continued to shift. But we'd face them as ourselves, armed with the greatest weapon humanity had ever created, our humanity itself. I heard helicopters approaching as the sun rose higher. Time to report in, to explain what had happened, to prepare for the next mission. After all, the monsters were still out there, and now they were afraid of us. 3 months after the incident at Monongahela, I stood in a new briefing room looking at faces both familiar and strange. My team had survived, though none of us came out quite the same as we went in. Cooper sat cleaning his phase disruptor, his movements precise and controlled. Most people wouldn't notice anything different about him, but I caught the way shadows seemed to pause around his hands, as if reality itself remembered what he'd almost become. He'd kept his humanity, but gained something else, an intuitive understanding of the spaces between dimensions. Torres had transformed from a tech expert into something more. The mathematical entities that had briefly possessed him left behind a gift. He could see the equations that governed reality. His detection systems now incorporated principles that shouldn't be possible, letting us track cryptids across dimensional boundaries. Dr. Romano's encounter with the void changed her perspective quite literally. She could perceive multiple possibilities simultaneously, making her our early warning system for dimensional incursions. Her research now focused on understanding how humanity could maintain its essential nature while adapting to a universe that was becoming increasingly fluid. Ghost emerged with a deeper connection to the ancient wisdom he'd always respected. The ritual components he once carried externally were now part of him in a more fundamental way. He could speak words that made reality listen, combining traditional knowledge with our new understanding of dimensional physics. As for me, well, the shadows still moved differently around me. I could feel the boundaries between dimensions, sense the places where reality wore thin, but more importantly, I understood what we really were. Not just soldiers or scientists, but storytellers. the ones who gave meaning to chaos, who turned darkness into light through the simple act of understanding it. The new briefing room was part of a transformed Project Wraith. After Harrison's disappearance and the collapse of the Monongahela facility, we'd gone through every piece of data we could find about the government's long involvement with cryptids. The truth was simultaneously worse and better than we'd imagined. We've confirmed dimensional thinning in 17 new locations, Torres reported, bringing up a holographic map dotted with swirling anomalies. The barriers between realities are still degrading, but not in the way Harrison thought. It's not about evolution or transcendence, it's about integration. The entities beyond the portal didn't seed Earth with humanity as an experiment, Romano added. They created us as a firewall, a species that could adapt to chaos while maintaining order, that could face the impossible, without losing its identity. But somewhere along the way, we exceeded their expectations. The map showed new cryptid appearances across the globe, but they were different now, less hostile, more curious, as if our actions in Monongahela had changed not just us, but them as well. They're running from something, Ghost said quietly. Something in the spaces between dimensions. Something that even they fear. That's why they're pushing through to our reality more frequently. They need us as much as we need them. Cooper looked up from his weapon. So, what's the play? We still hunting them? No, I said, standing to address the room. We're going to help them, but on our terms. The new Project Wraith had a different mission now. Instead of just hunting cryptids, we were working to understand them, to find ways to stabilize the dimensional barriers while allowing controlled contact between realities. We discovered that humanity's greatest strength wasn't our ability to fight monsters, but our ability to turn monsters into allies. The room screen showed our latest recruits training with specialized equipment that worked with their natural abilities rather than trying to suppress them. Every person who'd had a cryptid encounter, every soldier who'd seen something they couldn't explain, was a potential bridge between worlds. We've got reports of a new type of entity in the Antarctic, Torres said, bringing up thermal imaging that showed something massive moving under the ice. Preliminary analysis suggests it's similar to what you encountered in Kazakhstan. I smiled, feeling the familiar surge of anticipation. Prep the team. But this time we go in understanding what we really are. Not hunters, not prey, but mediators. The ones who stand between order and chaos and make both sides listen. As we geared up for the mission, I caught my reflection in a darkened screen. For a moment, my shadow showed what I could have become. Something vast and powerful, and utterly inhuman. But that wasn't our destiny. We were meant to be bridges, not barriers. Teachers, not destroyers. The entities beyond the portal had created us to be their weapons against chaos. Instead, we'd become something they never expected. A species that could look into the abyss and make the abyss blink first. Our helicopters lifted off as the sun set, heading toward another encounter with the unknown. But this time we weren't just fighting monsters. We were rewriting the rules of reality itself. And the best part, we were doing it our way, the human way. After all, every good story needs a proper ending, and humanity's story was just beginning.